There is a place that no longer exists on any map of the One Piece world. Ships do not sail there. Charts do not mark it. If you asked a navigator in Water 7 or a scholar in the finest library of the Grand Line to point to it, they would simply shake their head, because the truth is that the world itself was told to forget. Tonight we drift back 38 years to a small island in the West Blue where two of the greatest men who ever lived stood on the same side for one single day, where a monster wore a boy's face, and where the peace that Luffy now sails through was quietly, violently purchased. This is the God Valley incident, and if you're ready to let your body get heavy and your eyes get soft, settle into whatever you're lying on right now, and let's drift there together. If you feel like it, subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories, and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight as we glide gently into the past. Before we go there, it helps to understand why this island matters so much, why a single event that most citizens of the world have never even heard of quietly reshaped everything that came after it. Every war has a story told to the public, and a story that actually happened. And nowhere in the entire history of One Piece is that gap wider than at God Valley. The version taught in marine textbooks, the version whispered in bars by old sailors, and the version that Sengoku himself only ever refers to in careful, guarded fragments, is this. 38 years ago, the most dangerous pirate crew ever assembled, the Rocks Pirates, clashed with a temporary, uneasy alliance between a young vice admiral named Monkey D. Garp and the pirate who would one day become the king of the pirates, Gol D. Roger. The Rocks Pirates were destroyed. Their captain died. Garp walked away with the title, Hero of the Marines, that he never once wore comfortably, and the world moved on as if nothing more complicated had happened. That is the story on paper. The truth, as always in this world, is heavier, sadder, and far stranger than the paperwork suggests. Let it settle over you slowly as we walk through it, piece by piece, the way the pieces actually came together on that island so long ago. To understand God Valley, you first have to understand what kind of island it was before the fighting ever started. Because the tragedy did not begin with pirates arriving. It began with something far quieter and far more disturbing already happening there. God Valley was, on that particular day, host to something the world nobles called a native hunting competition. It is exactly as horrifying as it sounds, and I want to be gentle in how I describe it to you tonight, because this is meant to be a place of rest, not distress. But the truth deserves to be spoken plainly at least once. The celestial dragons, the self-declared descendants of the founders of the world government, would occasionally travel to the West Blue to treat human lives as sport. Native islanders, ordinary people who had done nothing but exist on land the world nobles considered theirs to use however they pleased, were hunted for entertainment. It was not framed as war or justice or even punishment. It was framed as a game. If you're finding this heavy, that's all right. Close your eyes a little tighter and just let the words carry you. We're not lingering here. We're moving through it gently. On that same day, this so-called competition doubled as something even more specific, a purge, a deliberate targeting of a particular bloodline that had drawn the ire of the world government. The Davy family, ordinary islanders with no crime beyond existing and being inconvenient, were among those being hunted that day, their homes marked, their names already crossed off in someone else's ledger long before the sun rose over the valley. A young woman connected to that family, a woman the world would later know simply as Ginny, was among the people trying to survive what was happening around her. This was the seed of everything. Not a battle for treasure, not a clash of egos between famous captains, but ordinary people being murdered for sport by beings who considered themselves gods. If you're drifting a little already, that's good, let it happen. We still have a long, calm road ahead of us, and I'll keep my voice low and slow the whole way through. The island itself sat quiet under an ordinary sky when the hunting began, the kind of sky that gives no warning of what's coming, blue and unbothered, the way skies always seem to be right before history breaks in half beneath them. God Valley was lush, green, the kind of place that under any other circumstances would have simply been beautiful, hills rolling down toward a harbor, forests thick enough to hide in, if hiding could have saved anyone that day. It did not, at least not at first. The world nobles arrived with their usual entourage, their holy knights, warriors bred and trained specifically to protect celestial dragons at any cost, men whose loyalty was absolute because their entire existence depended on that loyalty being absolute. Among the world nobles present that day was a figure who would later be revealed to matter far more than anyone in that valley could have possibly understood in the moment. A member of the 5 elders named J. Garcia Saturn, present in his personal capacity as a witness to what was unfolding, though what he actually was and what was about to move through him remained hidden from everyone, including, in a strange and quiet way, perhaps even from himself in that instant. Subscribe if this kind of deep dive is the sort of thing that helps you drift off. And if you feel like it, let me know what part of this story you're most curious about and settle back in, because the chaos is about to begin. Before the first blade was drawn, before the first shot was fired, God Valley existed in that strange, suspended stillness that always seems to hang over a place right before it becomes historic. Fishermen along the coastline had noticed the ships arriving days earlier, the telltale white sails of world government vessels moving in formation toward the harbor, and most of them had learned long ago not to ask questions when those ships appeared. There was a rhythm to how the celestial dragons traveled, a slow, unbothered arrogance to it, as though the very ocean itself owed them safe passage. And in a sense, it did, because no marine would ever dare intercept a world noble's vessel, and no ordinary pirate crew would ever be foolish enough to attack one either. The island's people, the ones who called God Valley home long before anyone from the government had ever set foot there, went about their lives in that final quiet morning with the particular kind of dread that comes from having seen this pattern before. Some of them remembered other hunts on other days, the way the laughter of celestial dragons could echo strangely across a valley, at the exact same moment someone's home was being burned to the ground. Let your breathing slow down here, in and out, because we are simply setting the stage, painting the quiet before the storm, the way any good bedtime story should, so that when the storm finally breaks, you understand exactly what it broke. The geography of God Valley itself deserves a moment of your attention too, if only because it explains why so many different factions ended up colliding there instead of spreading out harmlessly across a larger stretch of ocean. The island was compact, ringed by cliffs on its northern face and opening into a gentle harbor on its southern side, the kind of natural formation that made it an easy place to defend and an easier place still to trap someone inside. Thick tropical forest covered much of the interior, the perfect terrain for people to hide in, and also, tragically, the perfect terrain for people to be hunted through. A handful of small villages dotted the coastline, modest wooden structures built by people who fished the surrounding waters and farmed what little flat land the island offered. It was an unremarkable island in every way except for what happened there, the kind of place that could have existed in complete anonymity forever if history hadn't chosen it, almost cruelly, as the stage for one of the most consequential days in the entire story. Even now, imagining that landscape, the layered cliffs, the dense green forest, the quiet fishing villages, it's almost impossible to picture the scale of violence that was about to unfold across it in the span of a single afternoon. The Rock's pirates did not arrive because of politics or ambition alone. They arrived because word had reached them, carried by Ginny herself, in the desperation of the moment, that people were dying on that island, that the hunting was already underway, and somewhere in that crew of monsters and legends, that message mattered enough to change their course. The Rock's pirates, led by a man named Gol D, were by every account the single most terrifying crew ever assembled in the history of the world, a group so dangerous that simply naming their members reads like a list of apocalypses waiting to happen. Among them stood a young Edward Newgate, the man the world would one day know as Whitebeard, already carrying the quiet mountainous strength that would later make him the strongest man alive. Beside him stood a young Charlotte Linlin, the woman who would become Big Mom, her hunger for power and her monstrous ambition already fully formed even in her youth. There was Kaido, not yet the king of the beasts, but already displaying the kind of raw, reckless power that made lesser men flee at the sound of his name. Shiki the Golden Lion sailed with them too, along with Captain John, and others whose names have been deliberately allowed to fade from history because the world was never meant to remember how many of its most dangerous people once stood shoulder to shoulder under a single flag. Zebek's own goal that day was layered. Part of it was rescue, because people connected to his crew, people he cared about even if he rarely showed it, were among those in danger on the island. But another part of it was older and colder, a long simmering grudge against the world government itself, stemming from a stolen treasure taken from a place called Hachinosu. And beneath even that, an ambition so enormous it frightened his own crew at times, the desire to tear down the celestial dragons entirely and remake the world's power structure with himself standing at the very top of it. It's worth slowing down on each of these names for just a moment, letting them settle one at a time rather than rushing past them, because each one carried the seed of an entire future era inside them even then. Take Edward Newgate first. At the time of God Valley, he was not yet the man the world would come to fear as the strongest creature alive. Not yet Whitebeard in the way the New World would one day know him, with his own massive crew and his own island territory and his own quiet fatherly rule over hundreds of subordinates who called him Oyaji. He was simply enormous, physically and in presence, a young man whose strength already made seasoned fighters hesitate before approaching him, sailing under someone else's flag for reasons that remain mostly his own. Perhaps loyalty, perhaps ambition not yet fully formed, perhaps simply because the Rock's pirates were, at that point in history, the only crew capable of containing someone like him. Imagine him standing at the edge of that battlefield, already massive, already calm, in the particular way that only the strongest people in a room can afford to be calm, watching the chaos unfold around him with the patience of someone who has never once needed to rush into a fight. Then there was Charlotte Linlin, young, hungry, and already carrying the seeds of the empire she would eventually build on an island called Whole Cake. Her ambition on that day was not subtle. She fought with the kind of raw, escalating aggression that would define her entire life. And in the chaos of God Valley, she reportedly combined the strength of what would later become two of her most iconic homies, Prometheus and Zeus, unleashing an attack meant to overwhelm anyone standing in her path. It did not work the way she intended. Garp, arriving into the thick of the fighting, brushed past that combined assault with something close to contempt. A small, almost throwaway moment that nonetheless tells you everything about the gap between an already legendary vice admiral and a pirate who, however monstrous she would eventually become, was still at this point simply hungry and unfinished. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. A young Big Mom, decades away from ruling an entire sea territory, being brushed aside like an afterthought by a man who hadn't even drawn his full attention to her yet. Kaido, too, stood somewhere in that chaos, not yet the king of the beasts, not yet the man who would spend 100 years trying and failing to die, simply a reckless, overwhelming force even in his youth. The kind of fighter who threw himself directly into danger without a flicker of hesitation. It was in the middle of all this violence that fate handed him the exact tool that would define the rest of his life, when Big Mom, in the chaos of the theft that Kuma and Ivankov had set into motion, ended up with the fish fruit, model azure dragon in her hands, and chose, for reasons the story has never fully explained, to give it to Kaido rather than keep it or sell it or use it herself. It is strange to think that something as enormous as Kaido's entire dragon transformation, the very form he would use to threaten Wano and challenge the strongest pirates alive, exists because of a single quiet decision made in the middle of someone else's battle. A gift handed across a burning island almost as an afterthought. Shiki the Golden Lion moved through that same chaos too, already carrying the strange, gravity-defying power that would one day let him lift entire islands into the sky, and Captain John sailed somewhere in the mix as well, his own treasure and his own legend still years away from being fully written. Around all of them stood dozens of other Rocks pirates, whose names the story has deliberately allowed to blur into the background, ordinary in comparison only because they stood beside people who would each individually reshape the world. If you're feeling your breathing slow down already, good, just let it. There's no need to hold on tightly to every name. The shape of the story is what matters, and the shape of it is this. The single most dangerous group of pirates who ever lived was about to collide with the single most protected group of tyrants who ever lived on one small island on one single day. The Roger pirates arrived for reasons that were, in comparison, almost tender. Gol D. Roger's motivations that day had far less to do with revolution and far more to do with something achingly personal. A woman named Shaki, someone Roger cared for deeply, had ties to the danger unfolding on God Valley, and Roger, brash and larger than life as he was, could not simply let that stand. He set his crew in motion, sending them ahead to search for treasure and to secure the island's chaos in his favor, while he himself pushed forward with a single-minded focus on finding and protecting the person he cared about. There's something worth sitting with quietly here, something the story rarely slows down enough to say out loud, which is that Roger, a man history would remember as the greatest pirate who ever lived, a man who would go on to conquer the Grand Line and uncover the deepest secrets of the world, was in this exact moment simply a man terrified for someone he loved, cutting through chaos not for legacy or glory, but because he could not bear the thought of losing her. Let that settle over you the way a warm blanket settles over your shoulders on a cold night, comforting even inside a story this violent. If you're enjoying this pace, subscribe for more of these long, slow, one-piece stories, and feel free to tell me what other legendary event from this world you'd like to fall asleep to next. It's worth pausing here, in the calm space between one wave of chaos and the next, to think about who Shaki actually was to Roger in this moment, and why her safety mattered enough to pull the future Pirate King away from every other objective on that island. Long before she became the sharp-eyed, cigarette-smoking owner of the rip-off bar in Sabadee, the woman who would one day quietly guide Luffy toward his own destiny with nothing more than a knowing smile and a well-placed piece of information, Shaki was simply someone Roger loved, someone whose presence on that island turned an already dangerous mission personal in a way that none of his other treasure hunts or grand adventures had ever quite managed to be. Roger was a man defined, in almost every account of his life, by laughter, by boldness, by an appetite for danger so enormous it eventually cost him his life to a disease he refused to let slow him down. But underneath all of that, in this one quiet corner of his history, he was simply afraid, the way anyone is afraid when the person they love most is standing somewhere inside a burning building, and there is no way to know yet whether they are still standing at all. Rayleigh, Roger's first mate, the man the world would later know as the Dark King, found himself carrying an enormous portion of the crew's burden that day because, with Roger himself locked into his personal mission of finding Shaki, it fell to Rayleigh to actually engage the Rocks pirates directly when the two crews' paths inevitably crossed. Imagine for a moment the sheer scale of what that means. Rayleigh, a man whose strength alone would one day be enough to train the future Pirate King's successor, standing as the primary line of defense for the Roger pirates against a crew that included Whitebeard and Kaido in their younger, hungrier years. There is no small combat in this story. Every name involved is a name that shaped an entire era of the world, and God Valley somehow crammed all of them onto a single stretch of land in a single day, along with the ordinary innocent people who had simply woken up that morning hoping to survive it. Picture Rayleigh in that moment, calm the way he always seems to be calm even decades later, when Luffy finally meets him on Sabadee Archipelago, moving through chaos with the same unbothered steadiness he would one day use to teach a teenage boy the basics of hockey on a quiet, forgotten island. Even at his age in this flashback, still young by the standards of what he would eventually become, there is something in the way Rayleigh is remembered fighting that day that already hints at the legend he would grow into, holding a line against overwhelming odds, not through desperation, but through the same quiet, settled confidence that would later make him one of the very few people in the world capable of calmly discussing the Void Century without flinching. The rest of the Roger pirates fought around him, each of them holding their own small piece of that impossible battlefield, buying time, buying space, buying the seconds Roger needed to finally reach the person he had come for. And then, into all of this chaos, walked Monkey D. Garp. Garp arrived not out of loyalty to the celestial dragons, and this distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, so let it sit with you gently as you drift. Garp despised the world nobles. He would spend the rest of his career refusing every offer of promotion to admiral specifically because he could not stomach the idea of taking orders from people he considered beneath contempt, despite their birthright. People who used their status to hunt human beings for sport, exactly as they were doing on the very island where he now stood. Garp's arrival that day was framed officially as countering the Roger Pirates, a Marine responding to the movement of a dangerous crew, standard operating procedure on the surface. But something in Garp's own conscience, something the world would only much later begin to understand, pulled him toward protecting the vulnerable people caught in the crossfire, not the celestial dragons themselves, but the terrified, ordinary civilians who had nothing to do with any of this and were simply trying not to die. If you've ever wondered why Garp, a man who spent his whole life resenting the world government's corruption, ended up remembered as a hero for an event that on paper looks like he was protecting the celestial dragons, this is the quiet key to it. He was never protecting them. He was protecting the people the celestial dragons were hunting. And history, as it so often does in this world, simply rewrote the story to make it sound noble in a way that served the government's narrative instead of the truth. Also present on the island that day, at only 17 years old, was Garp's own son, Monkey D. Dragon, already wearing a Marine uniform, already standing on the edge of a life that would soon turn entirely against everything that uniform represented. Dragon moved through the chaos of that day and encountered a mother, desperate and pleading, begging anyone who would listen to save her children from the violence tearing the island apart. Dragon reached them. He managed to save one of 2 infant twins, a baby who would grow up not knowing anything about this day, a baby who would later be found tucked inside a treasure chest aboard the Roger Pirates' ship, raised into the man the world would eventually come to know as Shanks. The other twin, a boy named Shamrock, could not be saved. If you're feeling something tighten in your chest at that, let it be there for just a moment and then let it go, because this is the nature of this story. It is full of quiet losses tucked inside the larger, louder ones, small tragedies that history never bothered to record because they happened in the margins of a battle that was already considered enormous. Somewhere in that single decision, in that single failure to save both children when he could only reach one, you can feel the seed of everything Dragon would become. A boy who watched the world's cruelty up close, who felt firsthand the cost of a system that treated human hunting as sport, who would grow into the leader of the Revolutionary Army specifically because he could never again pretend that the world structure was anything other than deeply, fundamentally broken. There is a particular kind of stillness worth sitting inside for a moment here, imagining Dragon at 17, still years away from tearing off his Marine coat and choosing a different path entirely, still, in this exact moment, simply a young man doing what he believed a Marine was supposed to do, protect the people who could not protect themselves. He reaches through smoke and collapsing structures toward a sound, a mother's voice, and he finds her clutching 2 infants, twins, both crying, both far too small to understand any of what was happening around them. He can only carry so much through the chaos. He can only move so fast. And so he makes a choice that no 17-year-old should ever have to make, reaching for the child closest to him, the child he can physically hold on to as the ground shakes and the fires spread, and running. Somewhere behind him, in the smoke, the other twin, a boy named Shamrock, is lost. Not necessarily killed in that exact instant, as far as anyone has ever fully confirmed, but lost to Dragon all the same, out of reach, out of time, out of any ability to go back and choose differently. The infant he does manage to save would later be discovered tucked safely inside a treasure chest aboard the Roger Pirate's ship, an accident of fate that placed a future emperor of the sea into the care of the very crew that had come to that island trying to save someone else entirely. That baby grew up to become Shanks, carrying no memory whatsoever of the mother who begged for his life, or the brother he never got the chance to know, or the 17-year-old Marine who made an impossible choice in the space of a single desperate breath. If you're feeling something tighten in your chest at that, let it be there for just a moment, and then let it go, because this is the nature of this story. It is full of quiet losses tucked inside the larger, louder ones, small tragedies that history never bothered to record because they happened in the margins of a battle that was already considered enormous. Somewhere in that single decision, in that single failure to save both children when he could only reach one, you can feel the seed of everything Dragon would become. A boy who watched the world's cruelty up close, who felt firsthand the cost of a system that treated human hunting as sport, who would grow into the leader of the Revolutionary Army specifically because he could never again pretend that the world's structure was anything other than deeply, fundamentally broken. It is easy from a distance to imagine Dragon's turn toward revolution as something purely ideological, a man who simply looked at the world's injustice from an intellectual distance and decided it needed correcting. But God Valley suggests something far more personal sits underneath that choice, a memory of a mother's voice, a memory of a child he could not reach in time, carried quietly for the rest of his life underneath every decision he has made since. Subscribe if you're the kind of listener who likes these quiet character details woven into the larger history. And if you feel like it, let me know down below what part of this is hitting you the hardest tonight. And then let's keep drifting forward, because the battle itself is only just beginning to properly ignite. As the fighting spread across the island, something else was happening in the margins of the chaos, something that would ripple outward into the lives of hundreds of people who had no idea their fates were being decided in that single afternoon. Among the celestial dragon slaves present on God Valley that day were two figures whose names you almost certainly already know from later in the story, though at this point in their lives they were nothing more than captives, treated as property, stripped of names in the way the world of the celestial dragons always strips away the humanity of the people it claims to own. One was a young Emporio Ivankov, the other was a young Bartholomew Kuma. Both of them understood, in the way that only people who have lived entirely without hope can understand, that a moment like this, chaos on this scale, an entire island tearing itself apart around them, might never come again. It was the only chance they would ever get. In the middle of Rock's pirates fighting, Roger pirates fighting Marines fighting holy knights, Ivankov and Kuma moved towards something the celestial dragons kept close. Treasures far more valuable than gold, several devil fruits being held in reserve, the kind of overwhelming power that the world nobles like to keep on hand for their own amusement or protection. Kuma managed to consume the pawpaw fruit that day, the same power that decades later would let him push and repel anything he touched, the same power that would eventually be twisted and stolen from him entirely when the world government turned his own body into a weapon against his will. But on that day, in that moment, it was simply a desperate, starving man's one chance at freedom, and he used every ounce of that new power the instant he understood what it could do. With it, he managed something almost unbelievable, reaching out and physically removing 500 slaves from the island in a single desperate act, launching them away from the chaos and the death and the endless hunting, out into a world that was still cruel, but at least no longer actively trying to kill them in that exact moment. Ivankov, meanwhile, also managed to seize a devil fruit of his own during the chaos, one that would shape the rest of his strange and vivid life. And somewhere in the same tangled fighting, Big Mom, still young, still hungry, still building the foundation of the empire she would one day rule, managed to steal a fish fruit, model azure dragon, one of the rarest and most powerful transformations in the world, and in a decision that would ripple forward for decades, she handed that fruit to Kaido. If you've ever wondered how Kaido came to hold the power of an actual dragon, the answer traces all the way back to this single chaotic afternoon on an island that no longer appears on any map. Sit with the image of Kuma for a moment, because it's one of the most quietly devastating threads in this entire story. This is a man the world would later come to know as a nearly silent, towering figure, stripped of his own free will entirely by the world government decades after this day, turned into a pacifista, a living weapon with no memory of his own life, sent to carry out orders without protest or complaint. But before any of that, before the government hollowed him out entirely, he was simply a slave standing on God Valley, watching celestial dragons treat human beings as prey, understanding with absolute clarity that whatever chance he had at freedom would only ever come in a moment exactly like this one, chaos too large for anyone to watch him closely. When he reached for that devil fruit, he was not reaching for power in the way Kaido or Big Mom might have understood power, as dominance, as the ability to rule over others. He was reaching for the ability to simply stop being owned. And when he used that power, brand new and barely understood, to physically launch 500 other slaves away from that island, he was not thinking about legacy or history or what the world would one day say about him. He was thinking, as far as anyone can tell from what little the story has shown us, about getting as many people as possible away from that place before it was too late. There is something almost unbearably tender about that. A man who would go on to lose his entire identity to the world government decades later, spending the very first moments of his newfound freedom making sure other people got to keep theirs. Ivankov's escape carries its own quiet weight, too. The Ivankov the world would come to know is loud, theatrical, endlessly dramatic, the queen of Kamabaka Kingdom, a figure who commands attention the moment they enter a room, and who would go on to help raise the Revolutionary Army into the force it eventually became. But strip all of that away, and underneath it is simply someone who survived captivity on God Valley, who understood in that same chaotic instant that Kuma did. That freedom, if it was ever going to come, was going to come today, in the middle of legendary pirates and marines tearing each other apart, or it was never going to come at all. The devil fruit power Ivankov claimed that day would eventually let them heal, transform, and manipulate hormones in ways that would prove essential to the Revolutionary Army's survival in the years that followed. But on God Valley, in that exact moment, it was simply a tool for staying alive one more hour, and then one more hour after that. It is worth noticing, too, how directly this single afternoon threads forward into the Revolutionary Army as an organization. Ivankov did not simply escape God Valley and disappear into a quiet, private life. The freedom won that day became the foundation of an entire resistance movement, one that Dragon himself would eventually come to lead, built in part by people who had once been property, who understood in a way that ordinary citizens never could exactly how deep the world government's cruelty was capable of running. Every act of resistance the Revolutionary Army carries out in the current era of the story, every quiet rescue, every uprising against a corrupt celestial dragon somewhere in the world, traces a line of thread all the way back to this single chaotic afternoon on God Valley, back to a pawpaw fruit and a desperate reach for freedom that could have failed as easily as it succeeded. Let your shoulders drop a little, let your jaw unclench if you're holding tension there, because we're deep in the heart of this now, and the story is about to turn from chaos into something almost impossible to describe, something that reaches past ordinary pirates and marines and touches the very darkest, quietest corner of power in this entire world. Because somewhere in the middle of all of this, something ancient and horrifying reached down into the body of J. Garcia Saturn and simply took hold. The figure the world fears above all others, the shadow that sits above even the celestial dragons, above even the five elders themselves, the one whispered about only as Im, chose this exact moment, this exact island, to step directly into the conflict. Im possessed Saturn's body, using it as a vessel, and intervened not to protect the world nobles being hunted around them, and not even in any straightforward sense to punish the pirates attacking them. Im's intervention was something stranger and colder than either side of the conflict could have anticipated. In that moment, the pirates and the marines, who had all been fighting each other only seconds earlier, found themselves briefly united against something far larger than any of them, something that did not belong on a battlefield of ordinary flesh and blood at all. And it was here, in this exact instant, that the story takes its darkest turn. Im, still wearing Saturn's body, transformed Rox D. Zebek himself, twisting him, corrupting him, turning the already terrifying captain of the most dangerous crew in history into something closer to a demon than a man. The details of exactly what this transformation entailed remain some of the most carefully guarded secrets in the entire story, whispered about rather than fully shown, the kind of horror that the narrative itself seems almost afraid to look directly at for too long. What we do know is this: whatever Zebek became in that moment was powerful enough and wrong enough that it forced two men who had spent the entire battle as enemies, Roger and Garp, pirate and marine, to set aside every ounce of their rivalry and fight side by side, because whatever stood in front of them now was no longer simply a pirate captain to be defeated. It was something that threatened to consume the entire island, and possibly everyone standing on it, regardless of which flag they sailed under. Think for a moment about how rare this is in the entire history of this story. I am spoken of in every corner of the world that even knows the name exists at all, as something closer to myth than to a living being, a shadow sitting above the 5 elders, above the celestial dragons, above every visible layer of the world government's power structure, a figure whose throne room supposedly contains the destroyed portraits of kings who once dared to oppose the government's founding, kept as trophies of a war fought 800 years before any of this. For a figure like that to step directly into a battlefield, even wearing someone else's body as a vessel, even for a matter of minutes, is almost unheard of. It suggests that whatever the world nobles were doing on God Valley that day mattered to him far beyond the ordinary business of hunting islanders for sport. Perhaps it was the presence of so many of history's most dangerous pirates gathered in one place. Perhaps it was something about Rox D. Zebek specifically, his ambition to dismantle the celestial dragons entirely, that struck a nerve deep enough to draw out this ancient, hidden power. We may never fully know, and there is something almost soothing in that uncertainty if you let it be soothing rather than frustrating, the way not every question in a long, slow story needs to be answered before you're allowed to rest. What we do know, or at least what the fragments of this story allow us to piece together, is that Iam's intervention did not feel, to anyone standing nearby, like the arrival of a protector. It felt like the arrival of something that did not particularly care who lived or died on that island, pirate or marine or celestial dragon alike. Something operating on a scale of concern so far above the individual combatants that human lives barely registered as anything worth considering at all. And it was this, more than anything else, that finally, briefly, united two sides that had spent the entire day trying to kill each other. Not shared values, not sudden respect, simply the shared immediate recognition that whatever stood in front of them now was going to keep growing, keep spreading, keep consuming the island and everyone on it, unless someone stopped it first. If this feels heavy, let it be heavy for just a moment, and then let it drift past you the way clouds drift past a night sky, because we are near the turning point now, near the moment where all of this chaos finally, quietly, resolves. Picture it slowly, the way you might picture the final scene of a long, exhausting dream. The island around them scorched and cracking, fires burning somewhere in the distance, the sound of the ocean nearly drowned out by everything still collapsing across God Valley. Roger, exhausted from his own battles, his own desperate search finally resolved, standing now beside a man he had never once called an ally. Garp, equally exhausted, equally transformed by what he had just witnessed, standing beside a man the entire Marine organization considered its greatest enemy. And in front of them both, no longer recognizable as the captain who had led the most feared crew in the world, something that Im had twisted into a weapon, something that needed to be stopped before it could finish whatever Im had actually intended for it. Together, combining strength that neither of them had ever needed to combine before, Roger and Garp brought Rox D. Zebek down. He died there on that island in a form barely resembling the man his own crew had followed for years. And in the wake of that death, the Rock's pirates, the single most dangerous crew ever assembled, simply ceased to exist as a unified group. Whitebeard walked away to eventually build his own legendary crew. Big Mom walked away to eventually carve out her own empire. Kaido walked away carrying a devil fruit that would define the rest of his violent, restless life. Shiki, Captain John, and the others scattered into the corners of history, each one carrying a fragment of that day forward into whatever they became afterward. The crew that had terrified an entire era simply stopped existing, not through surrender, not through capture, but through the death of the single man whose ambition had held them all together in the first place. Subscribe if you've made it this far, and you're finding this pace comfortable, and feel free to tell me, if you're still awake enough to type, what you think I Am's true purpose was in transforming rocks the way that shadowy figure did, because even now, 38 years later, nobody in this story fully understands the answer, and neither, honestly, do we. In the aftermath, the world above needed a story it could actually tell, because the truth that a shadowy figure possessing a member of the Five Elders had turned a pirate captain into a monster, that the celestial dragons had been hunting innocent people for sport in the first place, that hundreds of slaves had used the chaos to finally escape captivity, none of that could ever be allowed to reach the ears of ordinary citizens. So the official story was quietly written, and it was simple, clean, and almost entirely stripped of its actual horror. Rox D. Zabek, leader of the most dangerous pirate crew in history, had been defeated in battle by a temporary alliance between Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp and the pirate Gol D. Roger. Garp was given the title Hero of the Marines, celebrated across the world as the man brave enough to stand against an enemy so dangerous that even a pirate crew had to be recruited to help stop him. He was offered the rank of Admiral almost immediately, the highest honor the Marines could bestow short of Fleet Admiral itself. And Garp, in a decision that says more about his character than almost anything else in his long, complicated life, turned it down. He refused the promotion specifically because accepting it would have meant, eventually, taking direct orders from the very celestial dragons he had just watched hunt innocent people for sport on that island. He would rather remain a vice admiral for the rest of his career, carrying a hero's title he never once wore with any real pride, than climb any higher into a system he had seen with his own eyes treat human lives as entertainment. Let that sit with you for a moment as you drift further down into sleep. The image of a man handed the highest honor his organization could offer, quietly setting it aside because he knew exactly what kind of world that honor would have chained him to. It's worth noticing how this single refusal echoes forward through the rest of Garp's life, quietly shaping decisions the story only reveals much later. Every time Garp is offered another promotion in the decades that follow, every time the Marines try once more to elevate him into a position of higher command, the same quiet resistance appears, the same unwillingness to place himself any closer to the celestial dragons than he absolutely has to be. He remains a vice admiral for the rest of his career, watching younger officers rise past him into admiral positions, never once seeming bothered by it, because rank, for Garp, was never really the point. Staying far enough from the world nobles that he could still look at himself honestly in the mirror each morning, that was the point. And it traces directly back to whatever he witnessed with his own eyes on God Valley, watching a hunting competition unfold against ordinary people who had done nothing to deserve it. There's a strange, quiet irony sitting inside this too, one that becomes only more visible with the benefit of hindsight. Garp is remembered by the wider world as the hero of the Marines, specifically for an event where his actual motivation had almost nothing to do with the version of heroism the government wanted to celebrate. He is celebrated for defeating dangerous pirates, when in his own heart the pirates were never really his enemy that day, at least not entirely. He is celebrated implicitly for protecting celestial dragons, when the truth is he could barely stand to be in the same breathing space as them. History in the world of One Piece is rarely an honest record of what actually happened. It is a story written by whoever survives with the power to write it, shaped to serve whatever narrative keeps the existing order standing a little longer, and nowhere is that clearer than in the gap between the real Garp standing on God Valley and the polished, simplified hero the rest of the world was told to celebrate afterward. The island itself did not survive the telling of its own story. God Valley, the place where all of this happened, where hundreds of slaves tasted freedom for the first time in their lives, where a monster wore a man's face, where two of the greatest fighters in the world's history stood shoulder to shoulder for one single, unrepeatable day, was erased. Not simply forgotten the way old news eventually fades from memory, but deliberately, systematically removed, scrubbed from official records, stripped from maps, folded quietly out of the world's collective memory the way the world government has always handled truths too dangerous to let ordinary people examine too closely. If you search for God Valley today, in the current era of the story, you will not find it. It simply does not exist anymore, at least not in any way the average citizen of this world could ever locate. Only a handful of people still carry the true memory of what happened there. Sengoku, who has referenced it only in the most careful, guarded fragments across the years. Garp himself, who lived the rest of his life with a hero's title that never once fit comfortably on his shoulders. And Dragon, who watched a mother lose one of her two children in front of him, who saw firsthand exactly how far the world's power structure was willing to go, and who has spent every year since building an army specifically because he refuses to let the world forget what he witnessed on that island, even if the world itself has been told in every official record that it never happened at all. If you're still with me, still drifting somewhere between awake and asleep, let's slow down even further now, because there's something worth sitting with quietly before we close this story out for the night. God Valley is not just a battle. It is the hinge point where an entire generation of the world's most dangerous and most significant figures all happen to occupy the same small stretch of land on the same single day. Whitebeard was there. Big Mom was there. Kaido was there. Roger was there. Garp was there. Rayleigh was there. Dragon was there. Shanks, as an infant too small to understand any of it, was there. Kuma and Ivankov, both later to become central figures in the Revolutionary Army and in the wider resistance against the world government, were there. And it was there, in that single chaotic afternoon, that they first tasted freedom. Every single major power structure in the current era of One Piece, Whitebeard's crew, Big Mom's empire, Kaido's reign over Wano, the Revolutionary Army's entire founding philosophy, Garp's quiet, lifelong refusal to serve the celestial dragons directly, all of it traces back, in some way, to this one island and this one day. Even the shadow above the 5 elders, chose this exact moment to step directly into the world's events, an act so rare that it may be one of the only times in recorded history that this figure has personally intervened in anything at all. There is something almost unbearably sad sitting underneath all of this, if you let yourself really feel it for a moment before drifting off. The entire event began not because pirates wanted treasure, and not because Marines wanted glory, but because ordinary people with names we will never know, people connected loosely to a family called Davy, were simply being hunted for sport by beings who considered themselves above humanity entirely. Everything else, the clash between legendary pirates, the uneasy alliance between rivals, the transformation of a monster, the theft of devil fruits, the freedom of 500 slaves, Garp's quiet refusal of a promotion, Dragon's slow turn toward revolution, all of it grew outward from that single, quiet horror. The world remembers God Valley, when it remembers it at all, as the day 2 legends teamed up to stop a monster. But underneath that clean, simple story is a much older, much sadder truth. That the monster the world actually needed defeating that day was never really Rox D. Zebek at all. It was the very system that had gathered on that island in the first place, treating human lives as nothing more than a game. There's one more thread worth pulling gently before we let this story rest for the night, and it has to do with how quiet, careful erasure like this eventually fails. The world government scrubbed God Valley from its maps and its records, told its citizens a clean, simple story about a hero and a monster, and for 38 years that erasure mostly held. But erasure of this kind is never quite as permanent as the people enforcing it believe it to be. Sengoku carries the memory, even if he only ever lets fragments of it slip out in careful, guarded moments. Garp carries it quietly, underneath a title he never wanted. Dragon carries it in the most active way of anyone, building an entire army specifically because he refuses to let a single island's erased suffering become the final word on what the world is allowed to remember. And, scattered somewhere across the world, 500 former slaves carry pieces of that memory too, woven now into the Revolutionary Army's ranks, into safe houses, into whispered stories passed between people who understand exactly what the celestial dragons are capable of because they lived through it firsthand. A truth this large, touching this many of the world's most significant figures, was never going to stay buried forever, and in a story that keeps circling back again and again to the void century, to hidden history, to poneglyphs carved specifically because someone wanted the truth preserved even when someone else wanted it destroyed, God Valley fits perfectly into that same pattern. It is simply a smaller, more recent example of the exact same pattern the entire story has been quietly building toward from its very first chapter. The world's most powerful people deciding what the rest of the world is allowed to know, and a small, determined handful of people refusing to let that decision stand unchallenged forever. Think, too, about how strange it is that this single island connects almost every major power center currently active in the story. Whitebeard's crew, which for years stood as the single greatest deterrent against total war in the New World, traces back to a man who once sailed under Rox D. Zebek's flag. Big Mom's empire, with its army of homies and its enormous territory in the New World, traces back to the same battlefield, Kaido's reign over Wano, and everything that eventually led to Luffy and his allies rising up against him traces back to a devil fruit, handed across a burning island almost as an afterthought. The Revolutionary Army's entire existence traces back to 500 people who tasted freedom for the first time in the middle of that same chaos. Garp's quiet refusal to ever fully align himself with the world government's highest ranks traces back to what he witnessed there. And Shanks, the man whose quiet, calm presence would one day set so much of Luffy's own journey into motion, was carried out of that exact same fire as an infant who never knew any of it happened. It is rare for a single afternoon in any story to sit at the root of this many separate, sprawling threads, and yet here it is, a small island in the West Blue that the world was told to forget, quietly holding almost everything else in place underneath it. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with something this heavy tonight, and thank you for trusting me to carry you through it gently. Subscribe if these long, slow dives into the deeper corners of this world's history are the kind of thing that helps you drift off. And if you feel like it, tell me down below where you're listening from tonight, and what part of the God Valley story lingered with you the most. We covered a lot of ground together: the hunting competition that started it all, the arrival of the Rocks Pirates and their staggering, terrifying roster, Roger's quiet personal reason for being there at all, Rayleigh carrying the weight of the crew's battles, Garp's arrival, and his son Dragon's small, devastating choice on that battlefield, Kuma and Ivankov's desperate reach for freedom, the devil fruits that would eventually reshape Kaido and Big Mom's entire futures, the horrifying moment Aim chose to step directly into the world's history, the transformation of Xebec into something almost beyond description, the uneasy, temporary alliance that ended his life, and the quiet, careful way the world scrubbed the entire island from its own memory afterward. It is one of the deepest, darkest hinge points in this entire story, and it still, even now, is not fully understood, not even by us. Let your eyes stay closed now if they've drifted shut already. Let the weight of this story settle into something calm rather than something heavy. Somewhere out past the horizon, the world sails on, unaware of most of what really happened on that small, erased island so long ago. And you can rest now, carried gently away from it, the way 500 people once were carried away from that very same chaos, toward something quieter, something safer, something like sleep. Thank you for drifting through this one-piece story with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new,